It was a hot summer night, and I was trying to fall asleep in my small apartment. But as I lay there in bed, I heard a faint scratching and sound coming from my closet. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way out of the closet. I slowly got out of my bed and approached the closet, with my heart pounding, and I hesitantly opened the door. I was met with a rush of hot, foul-smelling air, and there, staring back at me, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. The creature seemed to be covered in a slimy substance, and I could almost see my reflection in its skin. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its breath was hot and rancid. As the creature slowly emerged from the closet, I realized that it also had tentacles instead of arms, and with those tentacles it started to slither its way towards me. I was absolutely disgusted and frightened at the same time, so I tried to run, but the creature was too fast. Its tentacles wrapped around me, pulling me closer and closer to its gaping maw. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and it made me feel sick. I screamed for help, calling for my mum or dad or anybody to come in and save me, and the creature's eyes widened suddenly, and it slithered away back into the closet with the door slamming behind. My mum burst into the room, asking what had happened. I said to her there was a creature in my closet. She looked at me concerned at first, but then I continued to convince her that I was being honest, and there was something really in there. My mum slowly approached the closet door, and she could see the fear in my eyes. My fear seemed to transcend into my mother. As she approached the closet door, she slowly creaked it open, but there was nothing there. She stared into the black abyss and looked back at me sighing. I apologized and said maybe it was just a nightmare. But deep down, I know that it wasn't, because it just felt so real. I got back in bed, and as I laid there, sweating and shaking, I just couldn't shake off that feeling that the creature was still lurking somewhere in my room. Rest assured, I didn't sleep at all that night. It was a warm summer night, and I was camping in the woods with some friends. We had set up a bonfire, and we were roasting marshmallows when we heard a strange growling coming from deeper within the woods. We all froze and looked at each other in fear. We could see a black figure starting to emerge from the shadows, and we could tell it was tall and skinny, with bony, veiny skin and sharp teeth. Its eyes were bright and seemed to pierce through us, and then it let out a fierce growl and started to spit in our direction. We scrambled to our feet and ran towards the safety of our tents, but this thing was faster than us and caught up to us in seconds. It circled around us, growling and spitting some more, as we huddled together in fear. We were cowering in terror, and we started to notice flames rise around us. This creature seemed to be spitting some sort of flammable liquid that was igniting on contact with the ground. We were now surrounded by fire, and there was absolutely no escape. The creature continued to circle us, growling and spitting as the flames grew higher and higher. But just when we thought it was all over, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from a nearby tree. We turned to see a ghostly figure hovering above the flames, screaming in agony. As we watched in horror, the creature suddenly stopped its growling and looked up at the ghostly figure. The clouds in the sky started to swirl and change, and we saw other creatures emerging from them. There must have been tens of them, and they started to communicate with each other in some sort of language that we couldn't understand. They seemed to be angry and agitated, and we knew that we were in even more trouble than we had first thought. Suddenly, the creatures turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving us alone with the flames and the ghostly figure. We managed to put out the fire and eventually made it out of the woods, but we were never the same again. We couldn't explain what had happened that night, but we knew that we had encountered something truly terrifying and otherworldly. This experience definitely brought us all closer together, but I think we're all scarred and always will be. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through a deserted stretch of highway late at night. The only thing visible in the darkness was the faint glow of my headlights. As I drove further into the abyss, I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. My friends asked if we stopped the car quickly because one of them needed to take a leak. I pulled the car over and he walked over to a nearby tree. I was just sat in the car waiting when suddenly I saw something moving on the side of the road. At first I thought it was just an animal, but as I looked closer, I realized that it was a person. The person was standing at the edge of the road, facing away from me. They were dressed in an old-fashioned clothing, and their hair was long and unkempt. I rolled down the window so I could get a better look, and in response, the person swiftly turned around. At this point I realized that their face was twisted into a grotesque grin, and their eyes were black pits of darkness, even darker than the surrounding atmosphere. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I screamed at my friend to get back in the car. He ran over, jumped in and closed the door behind him. He didn't ask any questions. I started up the car and sped off as fast as I could, but the person started running after us, with their twisted grin growing wider. The car seemed to take forever to accelerate, and they managed to catch up to me, and I saw their hands were now covered in blood. They had managed to jump onto the car, and they reached out and tried to grab me through the window, but I managed to swerve away and speed off into the night. I drove for hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that terrifying figure, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. To this day, my friend still doesn't believe me. He thinks that I was just seeing things in the darkness. But I know that that was real. And now, whenever I find myself alone in the darkness, I can still feel that creature out there watching me, lurking, waiting to strike again. I've always had this bad habit where I seem to stare at my phone for hours straight, and before I realise it, my room has slowly turned to an almost pitch black. On this particular night, I was home alone and I suddenly noticed just how dark it was. I could hear the wind howling outside and the rain pounding against the windows. I was sitting in my living room on my phone, trying to ignore this eerie feeling that had come over me. As I got up to get a glass of water and switch on the light, I noticed something moving in the shadows. I turned on the lights, but there was no one there. I just shrugged it off and went to the kitchen. But then suddenly, I heard a loud thud coming from upstairs. I froze, listening for any more sounds. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking down the hallway towards me, and they wanted me to know it. I instinctively grabbed a knife from the kitchen and cautiously made my way to the staircase. As I climbed the stairs, the footsteps grew louder and my heart pounded in my chest. I reached the top of the stairs and I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. I could see it was tall, with long arms and legs, and its eyes almost glowed in the darkness. I tried to run, but it was too late. The figure started sprinting towards me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen before. It was a monster, a creature from my worst nightmares. Its skin was pale and leathery, with sharp claws and teeth. Its eyes glowed with a hunger that made my blood run cold. The creature lunged at me, and I fought back with the knife, but it was no use. The creature was just too strong, and it easily overpowered me. I could feel myself starting to gasp for air. I looked around my room, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, when suddenly I woke up in a cold sweat. I looked around my room, hoping to see nothing. And to my luck, I was all alone. But I couldn't get past that feeling, and I knew deep down that there was something sinister lurking in the darkness, just waiting for its next victim, and I can only hope that that isn't me. I was hiking in the mountains, enjoying this beautiful scenery around me, but as I got deeper into the forest, I started to feel like I was being watched. I shook it off, thinking it was just my imagination, and continued on my hike. I mean, it was probably just another hiker, or maybe even an animal, so I wasn't too worried. But as I was walking, I saw something moving in the bushes. I stopped in my tracks, trying to make out what it was, when suddenly a tall, crooked-looking man with long hair and black eyes emerged from the bushes. Upon further inspection, I noticed that he had a backwards foot, and his twisted grin sent shivers down my spine. I wondered if this was just a man who had got into an accident, but he was too tall and too frightening to be human. I attempted to make a move, but he suddenly grabbed me by the arm and dragged me deeper into the woods. As we walked, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees around us. The man brought me to a clearing where I saw other creatures like him. They had goat-like legs with wings and sharp claws. The creatures started to chant, and I felt like I was in a nightmare. I noticed them all just staring at me, looking deep into my eyes, all with the same smile on their face, when suddenly a deep rumble started to emerge in the surrounding area. Their smiles turned to concern as they noticed that there were people coming for them. A group of hunters suddenly emerged, armed with guns and silver bullets. They started firing at the creatures, and chaos ensued. In the midst of the chaos, I managed to escape, running as fast as I could back to civilization. But when I arrived back home, I realized that something was wrong. I was starting to hear voices, and I saw symbols carved into my walls, the same symbols that were on those trees. No matter what, the crooked man was still with me, haunting me wherever I went. I went to see a psychiatrist, but they couldn't explain what was happening to me. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old book in a library that explained everything. I had been marked by the creatures in the woods, and they were now after me. I realized that my only chance of survival was to find a way to break this curse. I went back to the mountain, armed with a silver blade and a wooden stake, and I tried to face the creatures head-on. But after hours of searching, I couldn't find them, and eventually, I gave up. I tried to move on from this experience, and I've been somewhat successful. But looking back, I know that that experience was something that will stay with me forever. I remember the year was 1984, and I was just a little girl, and many said that I had a vivid imagination. But on this particular night, my imagination was running wild, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows of my room. As I laid in my bed, I heard a scratching sound coming from underneath. At first, I tried to ignore it and convinced myself that it was just the wind. But the scratching grew louder and more persistent, and before long, I was certain that it was coming from under my bed. I slowly peeked, and my heart sank as I saw two big white eyes staring back at me. I froze in terror, unable to move or scream. The eyes were attached to a hideous creature with long, spindly legs that crawled out from under my bed. The creature's skin was scaly and slimy, and its breath was hot and foul. I tried to scream again, but no sound would come out. The creature slowly made its way towards me, and I felt its long, bony fingers wrap around my ankle. I tried to pull away, but its grip was too strong. As the creature pulled me closer, I could see its grotesque features up close. Its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth, and its eyes were filled with an insatiable hunger. I knew I was going to be its next meal. Just as the creature was about to sink its teeth into my flesh, I heard a loud banging sound coming from my wardrobe. The creature paused for a moment, and I seized the opportunity to kick it away and run towards the wardrobe. But to my dismay, as I flung open the wardrobe doors, I see another cryptid creature staring back at me. This one was even more terrifying than the first. Its body was covered in fur, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. The creature let out a loud, ear-piercing scream, and I felt my ears ringing. I collapsed to the ground, unable to move, and the creature slowly made its way towards me, and I knew I was done for. Just as the creature was about to pounce, I felt myself drifting off out of pure fear. Before I knew it, I was waking up screaming. It was at this point I realised that I may have just been dreaming, but it felt so real. I remember checking my wardrobe to see if there was anything there, and then I checked underneath the bed, but nothing. However, when I looked closer underneath the bed, I saw a clump of black fur, and I wondered, was it really a dream? Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about the hideous cryptid creatures that haunted me that night, and I still worry that one day they might return. One night I was on my way home from work, and as I was driving down the road, I noticed a strange clicking noise coming from just outside my car. At first I thought there was something wrong, or maybe it was just the rain hitting my windshield, but the noise persisted as the rain seemed to disappear. I pulled over to the side of the road to investigate, but that's when I saw them. 3 creatures, each one more terrifying than the last. The first one I noticed was massive, at least 7 feet tall and covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its long arms ended in razor-sharp claws. The second and third creatures were smaller, about the size of a large dog, but just as menacing nonetheless. They were bipedal, with mottled grey skin and oversized heads filling with rows of sharp teeth. They too emitted a strange clicking noise as they moved. As soon as they spotted me staring at them, the creatures began to advance. The big one led the charge, its massive jaws snapping hungrily. I could feel my heart pounding as I backed away, knowing I was no match for these beasts. But just when I thought it was all over, I heard another noise, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from absolutely nowhere. A 4th creature appeared, this one even larger than the first. It was a behemoth, at least 10 feet tall this time, and covered in tough, leathery skin. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and its jaws were large enough to swallow a person whole. The smaller cryptids seemed to cower in fear at the sight of the behemoth, as if they were its servants. But the big one was undeterred. It lunged forward, ready to take me down. I thought I was done for, but then something amazing happened. The behemoth turned onto the smaller cryptids, attacking them with a ferocity that left me in absolute awe. As the creatures fought amongst themselves, I saw my chance to escape. I bolted for my car, and I could hear the sound of the cryptids' claws scraping against the pavement as they pursued me, their clicking noises growing louder and more intense. I managed to make it to my car, but just when I thought I was somewhat safe, I heard a massive roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. It was clear the behemoth had won the battle and now was hot on my heels. I drove the car as fast as I could. I knew at this point that one false move would be my undoing. But just when it seemed like all was lost, I saw a light in the distance, the welcoming glow of civilization. With a renewed strength, I hit the gas and made a mad dash for safety. When I finally looked back, the cryptid was gone, lost in the darkness once again, but I knew they were out there, lurking just beyond the veil of night, waiting for their next victim to cross their path. I remember I was lying in my bed trying to fall asleep as I usually did, when suddenly I heard a strange scratching coming from outside of my window. It was so loud and persistent, and it truly made me feel uneasy. As I got up to investigate, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me through the glass. I realised that something was out there, but I just tried to ignore it and attempt to go back to sleep. But the scratching and growling sounds continued through the night. I didn't manage to get to sleep in the end, and every now and again I would check the window. Sometimes the eyes were there, sometimes there weren't. But the next day, I decided to do some research to try and figure out what was happening to me. I came across a story about a creature known as the Midnight Stalker. Legend had it that this cryptid had the ability to appear and disappear at will, and it had taste for human flesh. I didn't believe it at first, but when the scratching and growling sounds continued every single night for a week, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I could barely sleep, and I was constantly on edge, more than normal. There was one particular night that I heard a loud commotion coming from outside the window. I got out of bed and peered through the blinds, and that's when I saw them. There were 3 terrifying creatures with bony, veiny bodies standing outside my window, clicking and growling. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I watched in horror as the creatures crawled through the window and into my room. They were unlike anything that I'd ever seen before, with dark, oily skin and glowing red eyes. For what felt like hours, they circled around me, growling. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Suddenly, the creatures stopped and began to back away from me. I saw a figure in the corner of the room, a ghostly apparition. The creatures seemed afraid of it, and they disappeared into thin air. It was almost as if I had a ghost living with me in my room all this time, but it was protecting me. With this in mind, I was actually able to fall asleep that night, but the next morning I woke up to find that my room was completely destroyed. The walls were charred and there was a horrible stench in the air. I knew that the Midnight Stalker and its minions were not just a legend, but a terrifying reality. From that day on, I knew that I would never be able to escape the horrors of the cryptids. They had become a part of my world, haunting me every night with their scratching, growling and clicking. And who knows, maybe they would come back again. I just hope that that ghostly apparition will be back to save me once again. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.